just keep the feedback to yourself. It's for your own benefit. Let's give a round of applause to the presenter for the wonderful presentation. We must very quickly get into the next session. We must very quickly get into the next session because the presenter is online. We would have wished for a health break. Really, we need it. So I am constrained to make a decision. It's very difficult to reprogram someone who's online. So I am just going to appeal to you to really bear with us. And maybe for those of you who can't really manage to keep here, you can sneak out quietly and come back quietly. Now the next session, we have a presenter, Dr. Thank you. Philip is already online, waiting to start his presentation. He is a professor in adult vocational education and lifelong learning at the Institute of Education Science at the University of Graz in Austria. His research and teaching focus on educational management, didactics, teaching methodologies, international policy development, and informal learning. For almost 10 years, he has been researching on RPL in the context of vocational and professional qualifications. He is a member of the International Advisory Board of Prior Learning, Inside Out, the International Journal for Theory, Research and Practice of Prior Learning, Assessment and Recognition. And from 2019 to 2024, which is currently, is also a member of the National Accreditation Board for Basic Education Programs in Austria. So, from the short bio, he has a wealth of experience that is very relevant to this conference and the processes of developing RPL in the sister countries of Uganda and Tanzania. Now he's going to make a presentation on procedures for validation, RPL, and case studies from Austria. He's going to present 3 case studies. Now, like I have said already, case studies many times provide learning in very specific contexts, and usually they provide adequate detail that makes the knowledge generated from case studies transferable to various contexts that are similar to the ones in which the case study has been developed. So Philip, you're most welcome. You have 30 minutes to make a presentation, and then another 30 minutes will be reserved for comments and questions from the audience. We have participants from Tanzania and from Uganda, and all the participants are involved in one way or another in RPL or qualification frameworks. Thank you very much, and You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to present at this wonderful conference. I feel very honored to be here with you in these 2 days, even if it's just online. And I have been here watching and listening to the presentations and to the statements. And I must say that I really learned a lot. And this is also important because, as you just mentioned, case studies are always contextualized, and my case studies are based in the context of Austria. And I try to be as precise as possible so that you can take as much as possible to transfer into your contexts. Before I start with my presentation, can I please get some feedback on whether you see my slides and whether you hear me and everything's fine? Just a short feedback.
Yes, we can hear you and we are able to see the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, dear representatives of the ministries of local governments, dear delegates from the adult education and business communities, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday and this morning, the keynote speakers talked about the need for RPL and the challenges faced in the implementation of RPL, about policies, about case examples. In my presentation, and I would like to emphasize that already at this point, the main focus is on the procedures, as here in the title slide, specifically as they are located within an RPL program. RPL program is the term I use to refer to the organizational offer targeted at the learners. So when, for instance, an adult education center, a university, a vocational education center provides learners, workers, whoever, with a program for the recognition of prior learning. Before I delve into my argument, allow me briefly to contextualize my presentation a little bit. So I come from Austria, and my professional background, as was already mentioned, is in adult education and educational science. So when I approach RPL, to me, it is important to emphasize that all individual and collective learning, knowledge and practices have an intrinsic value. And this intrinsic value should be recognized regardless of whether someone eventually, in the end, achieves a qualification or not. So in Austria, we have an adult education system which is rather similar to yours and similar to many adult education systems in the world. However, when I talk about vocational education, you should know that in Austria, we have a historically very much very important dual vocational education system. So we have apprenticeship diplomas, which simply means that the learners in a vocational education track, in the initial vocational education, they have half of their program in a workplace and half in schools, and at the end they take the exam. I just say this because later on there will be one example for RPL exactly in this dual VET system. So preparing my presentation, I could read among others these two documents, like the National Qualifications Framework policy from Tanzania and also the IQLU implementing guidelines from Uganda. And I tried to get some impression of what is really relevant from the context of Austria in your context. And I must say that what I read in these two documents, I really appreciate that. And I think you have something to build on. So, okay, This is the structure of my presentation, and the goal of my presentation today is to encourage a discussion about the procedures, the goals, and the methods of RPL. I would like to start with some slides on basic RPL procedures, goals, and methods, and then present the 3 case examples. The first one is RPL in basic and compulsory education for adults. So this is similar to what you call ABET, basically. The second case study is on RPL for qualification at NQF levels 1 and 2. So at the very bottom of the NQF, we have 8 levels in Austria. The level 8 is the PhD, and level 1 is similar to basic education. And the third case example is RPL in dual vocational education at the NQF level 4. And then I conclude with some, call it if you want, recommendation from my perspective. It's a kind of a summary of what I think is important to consider. So please excuse any redundancy in my presentation, because as is the situation for the last presenter in the conference, there will be some concepts, some ideas that have already been mentioned by the presenters, Dr. Shirley Lloyd, and yesterday by the UEL. So I just, whenever I have the feeling that there is some redundancy, I will just speed up a little bit. Okay. On this slide, I have a question that is rather obvious now on the second day, and you have all engaged in discussing and learning about RPL, but I still want to pose this question. So what is RPL? And we have heard so much about it with different definitions and different models of RPL. And I have listed 3 ways of seeing RPL. The first one is accrediting outcomes. So RPL is the practice of reviewing, assessing, and accrediting what a person has learned outside formal learning context. But there's a second way of seeing RPL, and this is actually validating evidence. So RPL is also, to me, the collective attempt to find sufficient evidence for the skills and knowledge of a person to eventually arrive at a valid judgment. So that means basically that RPL is not just one assessment, but it ideally consists of several occasions and several moments of assessment, which all should come together in the end and lead to a final judgment about the validity of the learning outcomes. And a third way of seeing RPL is what I call an andragogical way of seeing RPL. Andragogical, simply adult education way of seeing RPL, is ascribing value. RPL means that learning contexts, learning processes, and learning outcomes are ascribed value, and that they are declared valid with regard to a specific context. What do I mean by this? Much learning and much learning outcomes are not seen by society and therefore not valued, simply because society pays attention to other things or other knowledge and so on. Think of what you learn, for example, when you care for your children. Is this socially valued? Is this something you get recognition for? Can you make use of it in a qualification, in formal education? For Austria, speaking for Austria, I can say that usually all learning outcomes and learning contexts situated outside of education, non-formal and formal, and outside of the workplace are hardly ever seen. We have a tradition of voluntary work in Austria. So voluntary work sometimes is socially valued, but everything that's outside, for instance, in the family and so on, is hardly ever seen. So RPL to me is also a way of ascribing value to collective practices of a group, whether they be historically formed, whether they are new, whether they are in a specific group, a community or not. So this is also one important way of seeing RPL. So this leads me almost directly to another important question, which I think should be considered, which is what kind of access can be provided through RPL. And access is a key term in the discussion about RPL. And we have heard that RPL leads to admission, it leads to access to to an educational program. It might lead to an access to an exam, a final exam, for instance. But I have illustrated here 3 forms of access, which I think are important. So the first one is formal access. And this leads to something like exchange value. The question is, will I, as a learner, receive a credential that confirms my knowledge and skills and that has exchange value in the education system or on the labor market? So does the credential help me basically in progressing to a next educational level or to another educational pathway, for instance? And the exchange value basically depends on 3 things, which is the general social standing of a qualification or an educational pathway, the quality of the RPL processes, they are really important when it comes to exchange value, and the involvement of stakeholders. It was mentioned in the previous presentation that knowledge is a key to understanding RPL, because usually when we talk about equivalence of knowledge, equivalence of skills from different pathways, there's always some kind of disagreement about what is value knowledge. So therefore, the quality assurance of the assessment process, of the recognition process, is really important to communicate to the education system, to communicate to the labor market that the qualification, the RPL process is something that has exchange value. The second form of access I have illustrated here is ontological access. And this is basically self-worth. Dr. Shirley Lloyd mentioned it before, that many, if not most, participants of RPL programs, they have some kind of fear, insecurity. Yeah, they don't know who they are, where they are, what they can do. They have doubts about themselves. They don't know if they belong to a community, if they belong to a society. For instance, if you immigrate to a new country, you ask yourself, will I be accepted? Will I belong to a community in this new country? So ontological access, the access of being part, also emotionally feeling recognized, part of a community of practice or in a society in large, is a key question to be posed in developing RPL procedures. And RPL ontological access is best enabled through things like group work, when there is group work involved in RPL processes, when the facilitators or teachers, or whatever you call it, fully recognize the learners with all their weaknesses, strengths, with their life situation, their interests, and when the assessors who are really also recognized by the learners. So there needs to be a mutual recognition between the learners and between the assessors, facilitators, and RPL staff. So this is also important, and they need to be recognized as valuable members of a community of practice. So when I want to become a member of a community, I need to have someone who assesses me who is a valuable member of that community. And this really gives me the feeling that I can be part of it. And the third one, and this is unfortunately often neglected in RPL, and I think it is really important, is epistemological access, because this has participatory value. So what do I mean by this? Basically, it means that RPL should not only be about what learners have learned in the past and what they already can do or what they already know, but epistemological access implies that we have to encourage them to the acquisition of skills or provide them with additional knowledge during the RPL process that help them in the end to lead a better life, having an understanding of the labor market, of democratic processes, etc., etc. So this is, for instance, I think about literacy skills, health and life skills, self-organization skills, learning to learn skills, and so on, but also knowledge that is needed for the participation in a democratic society. And from the research, we know that the process of RPL is usually also a learning process, because when you reflect about what you have learned in the past, this leads to new learning. It encourages new learning, but not just in the future when you enter an educational pathway, but also during the process. So there is a learning process taking place, and we have to consider this learning process in designing procedures for RPL. So this is what I call an epistemological access. On this slide, I have illustrated, and let's call it an ideal type of RPL procedure. And there are many things that have already been touched upon in other presentations, but I will briefly go into some details that I think are important. So the first step is orientation, which basically is information about RPL processes, and guidance. We've heard it that RPL is not very well known, neither to the learners nor to other communities. So there really needs to be a lot of information. Learners, participants, they really need to know what is going on. What can I expect from an RPL process? And then there needs to be a guidance, a facilitation, so that the learners can also epistemologically and ontologically access the process of RPL. Then follow 2, or I prefer 3 steps of assessment, which is the review of the learning outcomes, then a formative or a summative assessment, or both, and some kind of complementary learning or organized learning or self-directed learning. Why have I put so much emphasis on this complementary learning part? In my experience, and also in the research literature, there's much evidence saying that it is very difficult for learners to meet all the requirements of a qualification, whether it be in formal education or an NQF referenced qualification, especially when the qualification is broad. Then there are lots of learning outcomes demanded that learners, especially learners who come from a rather marginalized background, they can't meet all the learning outcomes. So there is some complementary learning needed. And this is why I included it and why I put so much emphasis on it. And there also it is important to consider that the assessment part could also be a continuous assessment. So there could be several phases of formative assessment and learning before you eventually enter into a summative assessment, which leads to the accreditation, the formal recognition, which is kind of equal to the admission to a program, to credits, to certificates. So this is basically an alternative pathway into education or to qualifications. And one must not forget on the very right bottom of this illustration, the quality management. And quality management should be an integral part of RPL procedures. So every RPL procedure should be coordinated by an organizing entity. It should be evaluated and further developed. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. One of the major consequences of RPL is that those who design the procedures, those who assess the learners and coordinate the program, they ideally learn from what the learners bring to the table. And by this, they improve their work. So RPL basically means that it is a constant process of learning by all people involved, not just the learners. It's a continuous learning processes of the program staff as well. So RPL is not a once and forever practice, in my opinion. The practice that constantly evolves through the exchange of all people involved, including the learners. And what that means basically is that when someone has a lots of knowledge about, I don't know, farming, whatever, you name it, and brings this into the RPL process, and you not really know how to deal with it as a teacher, as a facilitator and assessor, you learn from it. And next time another person comes with similar skills, with similar knowledge, with a similar background, you can act better. And this is what I mean by quality management, evaluation, and development. What I have on this slide is something about review methods and assessment norms. And I will briefly go through this and say just there are, in my opinion, two broad categories for review methods, which I call reflexive declarative and material performative. So material performative is basically what was called competence assessment, and reflective declarative is with portfolios, for instance, with curriculums, CVs, and so on, and also dialogue based. And I think that dialogue is a key to any RPL process. So the assessors, the facilitators, and so on, they really need to talk to the participants, to the learners, because only through talking you get to know about the other person, and through talking you also encourage the other person. You show recognition in the process of dialogue. When you talk to the person and say, oh, okay, I understand your situation. I see, but can you tell me a little bit more about what you've learned? Can you tell me a little bit more about your work context? Because I am, as an assessor, I am interested in what you bring to the table. So this is also a kind of ontological access that is provided through dialogue. And briefly, what I want to mention with the material performative methods is that there are performance-based methods which are maybe not very often used, but in RPL, basically you can also use role plays, games, poetry, paintings, whatever is useful and whatever shows that someone has knowledge and has skills that can be assessed with regard to a qualification, for instance, or just with regard to any future educational pathway. On the right-hand side, I have mentioned two criteria are 2 reference norms. So the first one is the criteria reference norm, and this is basically what is applied to RPL in NQF reference qualifications. So it's a comparison basically between the learning outcomes of a person with external criteria in a qualification profile. You say, okay, there is a learning outcome mentioned in a qualification profile, and then you have the person and you say, do they meet? Yes. If they meet, you tick it, and so on and so forth. So that's criteria reference norm. But there is also an individual reference norm. And I urge not to forget that an RPL procedure can take some time, some weeks, sometimes even months, and learners gain additional skills knowledge during this time. So there is a development going on during the process. And this development needs to be recognized as well. So it's not just a status quo assessment, but it can also be an assessment, a judgment of individual development over a period of time. So this is also to kept in mind and to be considered when designing RPL procedures. And later on in one of the case examples, you will see in a little more detail what I mean by individual reference norm. Okay, this is the last slide of the first part, and this is just to say there are 3 types. When we talk in Austria and the German-speaking countries, when we talk about RPL, we talk about 3 types of RPL. The first one is the integrated type, which simply means that RPL is part of formal education. It's integrated within the formal education system. Then there's a second type, which we call autonomous type. An autonomous type is located outside the formal education system, and it's organized by different actors. For instance, adult education centers, community learning centers, accreditation bodies, even workplaces can be involved. So this is located outside the formal education system. And usually the autonomous type is the one that is most often referenced in the NQF. Why? Because the integrated type is based within the formal education system. So in the Austria, there is no need to emphasize the NQF when you have a formal qualification. With the autonomous type, it is very important to have the NQF referenced qualification because it is outside of formal education. And then there is a third type of RPL, which is called the seconding type or the supporting type. And this is an RPL similar to what Dr. Shirley Lloyd called the alternative access route. So it's basically an RPL procedure that helps in the transition towards formal or non-formal education. And the standards here, they differ when compared to the integrated or the autonomous type. So there are andragogical standards, for instance, the way you interact with people, the way you support people, and it's not so much about qualifications or curriculum. It is just oriented towards curriculum and qualification. Okay, let's move on to the 3 case studies. And I will use this framework here with the 3 types to give you an impression of how the 3 case studies can be described. First of all, still let me say a few words about the Austrian policy context to give you an impression about the developments leading up to the 3 case examples. So in 2011, we had a national strategy for lifelong learning with 10 guidelines, and one of them was concerned with RPL. In 2016, we had an NQF law. And 1 year later, In 2017, the Ministry for Education and the Ministry for Research, Science, and Economy published a national RPL strategy. Strategy really means that it is a soft policy document. The same is true for the quality standards for RPL 2018 by the Ministry of Education. And when I say soft policy document, I mean that these documents had almost no impact. It sounds a bit strange, but unfortunately it is rather true. We in Austria, despite this kind of what looks like a cohesive framework, policy framework, we still have segmented practices and there is no overarching system of RPL. RPL is integrated within the different contexts of lifelong learning. So basic education, vocational education, continuing education, universities, and so on and so forth. But there is no overarching system. This just is a starting information about the policy context in Austria. Okay. The first case example is RPL in basic and compulsory education for adults. The type here is a seconding type, which means that RPL in this educational program is course integrated. It's a course integrated method which facilitates basically ontological and epistemological access. It's based within the context of non-formal education, within course-based programs for learners with basic education needs or incomplete compulsory schooling. And the goal is to improve basic competences and prepare for a compulsory schooling exam. The main actors here are adult education centers and also schools because they are by law responsible for taking the compulsory schooling exam. And it's funded 50% by the National Ministry of Education, Science and Research and 50% by the European Social Fund. This is the procedure that is applied in this RPL or basic compulsory education for adults. So there is a curriculum with 4 competence areas, which is German, mathematics, digital skills, and English. And then there are 3 assessment phases where RPL takes place. So the first one is an initial assessment, which the learners take at the very beginning of the program. Then there is continuous formative assessment. As I have mentioned before, these learners taking part in this program, they have a need to gain additional skills, whether it be literacy skills, whether it be math or digital skills. They don't meet all the requirements. So they need additional learning. And the continuous formative assessment is the recognition of this learning process. And at the very end, there is a summative assessment, which leads to an official credential. So there are 3 assessment instruments, which is a learner portfolio, the teacher observation guidelines, and an official credential. And on this slide, I have just added 3 kind of rubrics which are used in this RPL procedure. And you have on the bottom for the continuous self-assessment, competence areas, and then questions such as I already know. For instance, at the beginning of the program, I want to learn and I have learned. This is rather simple. I know this is rather simple, but it really is something that helps the learners and that is not too, it doesn't ask too much of them, because usually identifying what you have learned outside of formal education is a difficult is a difficult thing. Excuse me. So, and there is also a learning protocol used in this program, which includes questions such as, to me, learning is. In this program, I learned where and could I learn best. Can I learn best within a course, at home, with my friends, with my colleagues? Where can I learn best? How could I overcome difficult phases of learning? And so on. So these are some of the questions that the learners have to answer in a learning protocol. And the success factors in this program are basically the teachers, which use multiple didactics and methods, and they recognize the learners for what they are, with all their individual interests and needs. So this is one of the three success factors. A second success factor is the sustainable funding. So there needs to be the funding, because without the funding, it is really difficult to get the teachers, to get the assessors needed for the RPL procedure. Excuse me. And the third success factor is the social recognition of the program. And this is what I've mentioned before with the exchange value. So one of the problems in this program is that the credential that is given at the end is not really recognized, neither in the labor market nor in the educational system. So one of the success factors is really to work on the social recognition of the program. For instance, through the involvement of stakeholders. Okay. Oops, excuse me. Let's move on to the second case example, which is RPL for NQF level 1 and 2 qualification. And I will go into a little more detail on this because I think it is quite interesting, especially within the context of the IQLU program that you have in Uganda. So the type is an autonomous type, which means that there are 4 qualifications referenced at NQN level 1 and 2, and the 4 qualifications are in retail, housekeeping, gardening, and as a kitchen assistant, as a cooking assistant. And the context is non-formal adult education, and it combines workplace learning and basic education. And this is quite an interesting example of RPL because it's integrated. So the assessment, the recognition takes place basically in the workplace. So the goal is empowerment and qualification that help to find employment on the formal labor market. So the participants in this RPL procedure are usually people who are outside of the formal labor market. So maybe people that you have in the informal labor market. So, okay. On this slide, I have added the descriptors, the main descriptors of the Austrian qualification framework at the level 1 and 2. And the main descriptors for knowledge are basic at the level 1 are basic knowledge about reading, writing, math, ICT, societal norms, or the functioning of the labor market. The skills are basic skills needed to carry out simple tasks and participate in the workplace. And the competences are the ability to work and learn under direct supervision in a structured context. When you look at the qualification at the NQF level 2, the main difference here is in the competences. And it says that the competence under NQF level 2 is the ability to work and learn under supervision with some degree of autonomy. I emphasize this because in a minute you will see how this RPL procedure has used these two descriptors to create a digital application for the assessment of the prior learning. First of all, though, let's take a quick look at the procedures in this RPL program. And it basically consists in a continuous formative assessment, which you see at the bottom here, where there is workplace learning in social integrative enterprises, and there is a dialogical self and expert assessment. And this assessment is integrated or done with the ComCom, that's what it calls, the ComCom digital application. You see a picture on the top right-hand side of the slide. This is kind of what the application looks like. And the application can be used by both the learners and the assessors at the same time. So there are different areas where the assessor can do the assessment and then for the self-assessment of the learners. And it combines the four competence areas, which is functional competences, personal competences, social competences, and disciplinary competences. And there are for each competence area, there are 5 learning areas, such as I can do this in my workplace, or I am responsible for this and that. And then there are 4 assessment criteria, which I will mention in a second. And what's interesting with this application is that it leads to an automatic calculation of a final score. And this is what it looks like. So they have very simple application with 4 smileys. And the 4 smileys, they say, I can't do it at all. I need much support. I need some support, or I can do it autonomously. So I have added 2 examples on the left-hand side of the slide. One for a qualification in gardening and in the competence area of functional competencies, for instance, with the task of planting vegetables. So the learners are simply asked, can I do it at all? Do I need support? How much support do I need? Or can I do it autonomously? And what they did, and I think this is quite an interesting, if still very simple twist in this design of this procedure, they said, okay, if I need much support, this is level 1, NQF level 1. If I need some support, or if I can do it autonomously, this is level 2, because this is what the main descriptors of the NQF levels say. So can I do it autonomously? If I can do it autonomously, this means that I am more at the level 2. And since there is a continuous assessment of both sides, an assessor, which is actually a supervisor in the workplace, and the learner themselves, and they do it several times, and they can do it like for a year, and they can do it for 2 years, however long it takes until someone reaches the level it needs to get the qualification. It calculates a final score, and the final score says, okay, you are more at the level 1 or you are more at the level 2. And this final score can then be used for a summative assessment interview where where 2 assessors and the learner participate, and they just talk about the results of the application, of the assessment in the application. And then they decide whether this person meets all the criteria needed for the qualification at level 1 or level 2. What are the success factors of this RPL process? And it's basically that it's work and assessment are integrated, and it leads to a recognized qualification which facilitates transition towards the formal labor market. I will now come to the very last example, and it's the one that I mentioned is integrated in the dual vocational system and leads to an apprenticeship exam and an apprenticeship diploma for workers with more than 3 years of experience. And this is what the procedure looks like. The procedure is quite complex in this case, but I think it is interesting because it combines several steps. It combines an initial counseling, leading to 3 portfolio workshops for self-assessment. And at the end of the portfolio workshop, there is what they call a Quali Check 1, which is basically a formative assessment. And at the end of the formative assessment, the learners get a feedback on what they still need to learn. And then there will be a complementary learning in adult education centers. And if they have completed this complementary learning, they can access the Quali Check 2, which is the summative assessment that is equivalent to the regular apprenticeship exam. And this is what the procedure looks in more detail. And I have just mentioned these 2 elements, the formative and the summative assessment, in the 3 different portfolio workshops. And what is really one of the absolute success factors of this example is that it's based on group work. I have it here. This is as a result of a research study I just completed 2 weeks ago on this RPL program, and the most important success factor is the workshop groups, because the workshops group not just enable that you learn about what your prior learning outcomes are, but you learn about the work of others. You learn from each other because you help each other in preparing for the assessment and so on. And it also facilitates a feeling of belonging. The second success factor are the facilitators and the trainers, which show a genuine interest in the learners and their situation and so on. And the third success factor, and I really want to emphasize this before I come to my conclusion, the program coordinators. Because the program coordinators, they bring together all relevant actors. And then they support the facilitators and the assessors in the process. Because usually there are assessors involved from formal education which have little knowledge about RPL. So the program coordinators are really responsible to inform the assessors, to inform the facilitators, to create something like a capacity development so that the program can really be implemented. All right. So this is the final slide of my presentation, and there are some conclusions that I would like to mention, which is that RPL policy and system is needed, but you also need RPL procedures. And the question that I suggest you to consider is, where do you want to start? And where do you want to put the focus? At which level? Yes, I know that an overall RPL system is an important thing, but a bottom-up approach is also quite interesting to say, okay, let's start here with one program, with 2 programs, and then move upwards to a system. This is also one approach that can be taken. Second conclusion, there are different types of RPL. And the question is also, which type is easiest to implement? Which goal is easiest to achieve, and which is most beneficial to the learners, and which procedures serve the learners best? And then I would say that also RPL is more than qualification, because there are different forms of access: formal, ontological, and epistemological, and all 3 should be kept in mind to have a holistic RPL. And at the level of the procedures, some of the success factors I just mentioned. And then one last point that I feel that is important to me, since I have studied some of your documents, and I would say that don't start from scratch. There is much to build on from the IQLU program, for instance. I never was quite impressed by this program, and I think there are many things that can be adapted in developing an RPL program. For instance, the CLCs, the role of the CLCs, the role of the facilitators in the CLCs, What can they do within an RPL process? Then also the baseline, the continuous and the summative assessment guidelines, I think they are really good. And this is something to start with in designing an RPL process. So thank you very much for your interest in my presentation, and I look forward to your comments, questions, and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. We appreciate the presentation. And just as I had suggested and predicted, case studies are always down to earth. They provide real-life examples, and the knowledge generated from analyzing case studies can be applied in the contexts that are very similar to the environments in which the case studies were conducted. But I think also they can be slightly modified and applied in contexts that are different. So, Philip, we are going to start with comments from your presentation since you are online, because we also understand that Dr. Shirley Lloyd also made a presentation. People may have observations and questions and comments, but we shall start with yours since you are online. So I'm calling upon the audience to make observations, comments, or in case you have questions, Philip is online and willing to address the issues that we may raise.